Hi again, everyone. I just want to make a quick message, then I'll start the story. Feel free to skip ahead if this doesn't interest you. All of you watch every single video I post, even when there's a 1 week wait, sometimes a 2 week wait. I put most of my time into writing, so I don't get around to narrating as often as I feel I should. I find it easy to write no matter where I find myself, no matter what I'm doing. Whereas with narration, I have to set aside time in my schedule to do it. So I'm trying to get better at that. But thank you so much for your patience. If bonus videos interest you, be sure to check out my YouTube and Patreon membership options. But of course, the vast majority of my stories will be on the channel for all of you to watch, so don't worry about that. For those of you who are new to the channel, I'll just tell you a little bit about how it works. Every story here is my own. Every story takes place in a connected universe, which means you'll see organisations and supernatural ideas overlapping. There's always a thread that binds everything together throughout my stories. Those of you who are new to the channel, hit the subscribe button for more, and be sure to hit the bell so you never miss out on anything new that I post. That's all. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. The fountain of youth is real, but it isn't a fountain. And no matter how much that place gives, it will always take more. My 50th birthday was the catalyst for what would be an ill-fated expedition to this supposedly mythical place. On that day, which should have been a joyous one, I came to the rather grouchy conclusion that anyone who had ever called aging a privilege must have either been too young to know any better, or too old to care. I, on the other hand, cared far too greatly about the number attached to me. I had reached life's midpoint, wedged between youth and decrepitude, between adolescence and the twilight years. That's supposed to be the sweet spot, isn't it? The real meat of a person's life. For years I believed as much. I loved my 30s, didn't mind my 40s. But hitting 50 last month, that sparked a shift in my demeanour. Now there's no real difference between 49 and 50. Even in such a bleak headspace I knew that. But my sense of logic was overruled by my emotions. There was something rotten about seeing "Happy 50th birthday" plastered across the birthday banner that my family had hung in the living room. Listen, I wasn't ungrateful for my life. That old adage is right. To age is a blessing. Looking back, I was simply having a bad day. I should have waited out that blip of a midlife crisis. I'm sure that a week or two later I would have quickly come to my senses. I would have realised that I was fortunate to be getting older at all. Fortunate to have a loving family, and to spend so many wonderful years with them. By wishing for more, I ended up with less. And all I wish now is that I hadn't expressed my post-birthday blues to a younger colleague at work. I know how you feel, Nick huffed dejectedly as we ate lunch in the break room. You know, when I turned 30 last year, I realised my youth had died. Game over. It took all of my willpower not to throttle the man right there and then, but I managed to smile politely. What I would have given to be Nick's age. Those were the days. Back when I didn't have joints that seemed chagrined by my insistence upon, say, a simple walk farther than a quarter mile. I realised that I'd taken my 30s for granted. Of course, ironically, I didn't see that I was taking 50 for granted too. Heavens, that boy is insufferable, isn't he? Chuckled Clarence once Nick had left the room. I grinned and nodded in agreement with the departmental director, that grey-haired, bushy-moustached, 70-something-year-old gentleman who sat at the table next to mine. He was one of the organisation's few employees older than me. Some teased that he might be older than the company itself, though Clarence had only been with us for a decade or so. Nonetheless, the man had accomplished a staggering amount in that time. He'd climbed the company's ranks faster than I had, in any case. And I wouldn't have dared try to challenge him. Nobody would have. It was hard to keep up with the vampiric fellow. In spite of his age, there was an air of life to him, though. Not necessarily youthfulness, I wouldn't go quite that far. The crow's feet, white hair, and many folds of his brow all served to debunk any such notion. Additionally, it wasn't necessarily an air of vigour. Rather, Clarence simply had the look of a man who had lived multiple lifetimes. He looked wise, experienced, ancient in the most complimentary way possible. Perhaps his use of the Queen's English inspired that thought. The director's received pronunciation certainly earned him a few crass nicknames from employees whenever he was out of earshot. Aside from the existential crisis, did you have a pleasant birthday, Jeremy? Clarence asked. I turned to him and nodded. Yeah, my wife and son really pulled out all the stops. They jumped out at me with my brother, sister, nieces and nephews. It was a nice surprise. A nice do. A nice do, Clarence repeated. Then he let loose a smile wry yet slight. That doesn't mean anything at the end of the day, does it? I raised an eyebrow. I beg your pardon, sir? Well, for the olds, the niceness of life means nothing, the old man clarified. Nice, not so nice, or middling, it doesn't matter. It's all the same flavour of terrible. My best days this year didn't compare to the worst days of my youth. The days before aching bones and a myriad of ailments. Do you see what I'm saying, Jeremy? What matters is life's duration. How many years, months, weeks, or days remain on the clock. Quantity, not quality. I chuckled uncomfortably. That's quite a cynical view, Clarence. Oh? He replied, raising an eyebrow. And you do not share that cynicism, Jeremy? What about the things you said to Nick? I sighed. I was venting my frustrations. I wouldn't take any of what I said too seriously, Clarence. I'll be okay once I get over this little wobble. Aging is a privilege, after all. That's what my mother used to say. And where is your mother now? Asked the director coldly. My tongue caught against my teeth, stopping me short of responding bitingly. Truth be told, I was too frightened to respond. Too chilled. Chilled not only by the callousness of my colleague's words, but the oddness of them. Clarence had always been a slightly strange and distant man, but this was the first time he had ever unnerved me. You need not simply settle, Jeremy, whispered my elderly colleague. What would you say to joining me on the upcoming company trip? To Miami? I asked. Clarence nodded. In an attempt to diffuse the tension, I joked. So you're saying that I'm old enough to go on the big boy trips now? Is that it? The old man got up and shuffled towards the door, patting my shoulder on the way. January the 25th, Jeremy. Make a note of that. Okay? Now, I could sit here and type about the business trip to Miami, about the clients I schmoozed to get a foothold on a high rung of the corporate ladder. However, it wasn't a business trip. Not for me, anyway. Clarence made that abundantly clear. Today, Jeremy, you and I will take a boat to the island of North Bimini, he explained as I clambered into a taxi with him. Opposite us sat a young woman. I didn't recognise her from the company. Jeremy, I would like you to meet Layla. The brunette lady smiled at me, and the vibe in that car started to reek of something sordid. I feared that Clarence might be taking me to some less than reputable place for less than reputable activities, if you catch my drift. I wasn't sure of the lady's occupation. When the taxi dropped us off at a rickety old dock, we were greeted by a rickety old captain, a bearded, stocky, middle-aged man named Malik, who led us to his rickety old boat. He was a local from North Bimini, who Clarence had paid a sizable sum of money to ferry us to that Bahamian island. Curiosity drove me to clamber onto the boat along with Captain Malik, Director Clarence, and Layla, the mystery girl. If I could go back, I would stop myself. But only when we were halfway between Fort Lauderdale and North Bimini did I ask any questions. Why are we going to this island, sir? Why did you only bring me? This hardly seems related to, anything company-oriented. Clarence smiled. I didn't agree to come on this trip for business, Jeremy. It was fortuitous, that is all. Every once in a blue moon I fly to the States in search of a place. I've found it many times before. But it moves. Retracing one's steps is fruitless. Fortunately, 5 days ago, Miss Layla did the legwork for me. Sorry, I don't understand, sir. What do you mean by a moving place? I asked. The old man took a pause, then exhaled deeply, euphorically. A place more beautiful each time I find it. When I say its name, you will want to laugh, Jeremy, but you mustn't. I wish to speak candidly and with the utmost sincerity. Do you understand? I nodded, still a little frightened by the man's new disposition. He seemed on the verge of anger, if one were to do even the slightest thing to upset him. Very well, he continued. Jeremy, on the island of South Bimini, there is a historical landmark that draws tourists from all over the world. But it is purely for show. What landmark? I asked. The Fountain of Youth, Clarence answered. A well in the heart of a dirt patch. A whimsical hotspot for tourists inspired by a supposedly mythical place. A place for which explorers long searched centuries ago. Jeremy, it was never a tale of fiction. The fountain's true location simply flitted from location to location. Its position has changed so rapidly that very few men and women in history have ever found it. But I have. I have found it many times. The real fountain. Then the old fellow paused and hunched forwards on the bench opposite mine, with eyes narrow and accusatory, as if challenging me to laugh. However, I was too befuddled to laugh, too perplexed by the lack of humour in Clarence's tone. He wasn't pulling my leg. He truly believed in the fountain of youth. I could see that in his eyes. Mocking the man wouldn't have been wise. I read as much in his unstable gaze. Instead, I took the director's statement at face value and offered the obvious response. No, sir, there is no fountain of youth. It's a story. Clarence violently shook his head. You're wrong. I've seen it with my own eyes. 10 times. I frowned and chose my words carefully. Listen, sir, I'm willing to believe that you and Layla have, at different points in your lives, stumbled across spectacular fountains, hidden gems in nature. I'm sure you're about to take me to one of those fountains. But those bodies of water, which will have been natural, not mystical, mind you, were separate from one another. A fountain cannot physically move from place to place. That's impossible. You're joshing me, aren't you? You're going to tell me that I've been duped, that I've been gullible and fallen for your little joke, right? I'm being silly, am I not? No, you're right. A fountain can't move. Not the kind of fountain you're picturing, Layla said. Look, I understand your reservations, Jeremy. I was doubtful too. I was scared at first, but when I saw it, everything just... I changed, Jeremy, and you'll change too. It's not a story. I spent 8 years searching for this place, and it's real, okay? 8 years? Since you were a child, I inwardly quipped, whilst outwardly scoffing at the woman who seemed to be in her mid-20s. A lost pup, who, in my eyes, had no need for a fountain of youth. She already possessed heaps of the stuff. I have only found the fountain so many times because I am forever watching and listening, Jeremy, said Clarence as he pointed 2 fingers at his eyes, then 1 at his left ear. When the lovely Layla returned to the East Coast and started boasting of her historical find, word got back to me across the pond. I didn't hesitate to make her an offer, of course. A better offer than anyone else made. You see, I never know when the fountain will reappear, but whenever it does, I do not squander the opportunity, Jeremy. It has been, as you can tell from my wrinkled skin, quite some time since I have seen that beautiful place. I shan't miss this window, and neither shall you, my friend. You're both absolutely insane, I thought to myself, but I feigned a smile and nodded again, like some captive. I was aware that I had no means of escape. Malik seemed to be the only sane person on the boat. I'd clocked the captain rolling his eyes as Clarence made outlandish claims of that famous fountain with de-aging properties. I wondered how much money I'd have to thrust the locals' way to be ferried straight back to Miami. That may sound a little excessive, but I didn't feel safe about the prospect of being stuck on a tiny island with 2 head cases. Still, I also didn't fancy challenging the authority of the man who was, essentially, my boss. Instead, I chose once again to challenge the validity of his story. My backup plan was to simply cross my fingers and wait for Clarence to admit that he'd been joking the whole time. "You said it's not a fountain," I started. "What is it then?" "Well, I actually said that it's not the kind of fountain you're picturing," Layla corrected. "Fine," I said. "But what does that riddle mean?" The woman opened her mouth to answer, but Clarence raised a hand, and Layla suddenly assumed a stiff, upright, eerie posture, buttoning her lips as if she were a ventriloquist's dummy. Our tour guide seemed, behind the exhilarated eyes and beaming smile, to be afraid. Afraid of the director. And I didn't blame her. In fact, I was half considering swimming back to shore. "Let's not spoil the surprise, Layla," Clarence said, tapping a finger against his lips. "Jeremy needs to see it for himself." The 3 of us sat in silence for the rest of the voyage, and I watched as our tugboat neared North Bimini. The island was laden with white-walled resorts, boat-filled docks, and an ocean of trees, green, woolly, and welcoming. Yet, thanks to the disconcerting man sitting opposite me, nothing about the island felt inviting. Moreover, we were sailing past those signs of civilization. Clarence, Layla, and I disembarked from the boat at an isolated shore towards the north side of the island. Malik stayed behind with his boat, mumbling grouchily to himself as the rest of us trudged across sludgy mud towards the cluster of trees ahead. As we walked away, I kept thinking about how irritable the captain seemed. I had a suspicion that we weren't legally permitted to dock there. For the best part of 20 minutes, the 3 of us cut through a dense woodland in silence. I could have refused to accompany Clarence and Layla. Could have waited with the boat, but I didn't. A feeling beyond piqued curiosity was propelling me forwards. I had a hankering for something just out of reach. That urge deepened my dread, yet it also stirred a passion within me. An urge driven by whatever disquieting force, seemingly below my very feet, pushed me onwards. I feared that feeling, deep in my chest and my loin. Feared the source of it, which was so unknown, alien, and inescapable. And then the 3 of us reached it. Not a glistening pool of blue, twinkling under the afternoon sun, but a hole in the dirt, 10 meters in diameter. A cave entrance inviting us into the soil, into another world below the island. Perhaps below our world itself. "Remarkable," Clarence whispered, as he led the way down, torch in hand. The surprisingly spry man found purchase on a sloping embankment of mud, which formed a sharp decline from the cave's mouth to some distant floor below. And when the strange man didn't slip to his death, Layla and I followed. As I carefully dug the heels of my boots into the cave's muddy ramp, the woman scurried merrily downwards. With the eager bounce of her boot soles against the slope, it was clear that her sense of wonder remained intact. But I hadn't forgotten her uneasy disposition on the boat, following Clarence's commanding hand gesture. Still, all doubt and dread in her mind seemed to wash away as she giddily trailed behind our fearless leader into the island's large chasm. 50 metres down, the slope finally levelled out, and we reached the cave's floor. Ahead of our exploring trio stood a cylindrical tunnel of rock, bored by tools that couldn't possibly have been man-made. The curvature of the passageway was far too pristine. New. Youthful, I jestingly thought to myself, perhaps in a bid to settle that awful knot in my chest. My instinct was to run back to the surface, back to the boat. Yet I followed Clarence and Layla into the tunnel, followed them with such casual, willing footsteps that it seemed as if my body were unaware of my mind's urge to run. It was a feeling muddied by that warm desire I had felt in the forest above, a desire that burned brightly as Clarence's torchlight started to illuminate a dome-like cavern of mud and rock at the end of the tunnel. And it took all of my will not to eke out a little gasp of joy as we crossed the threshold into the cavern. You see, I didn't like that feeling, that happiness within me. It didn't feel like my own. It didn't feel freely willed. We entered a mud dome 30 metres tall and wide, and at its heart was, again, not a fountain, not even a pool of water, but what was there did not, I had to admit, make rational sense. Did not seem to abide by the laws of nature as far as I was concerned. It was a small forest with a cluster of trees, plants and shrubbery, all inexplicably surviving without any aid of the sun above ground. Forest feels like an embellishment, however. This teensy collection of luscious trees covered a grassy mound that barely covered 2/3 of the cavern's surface area, as if some deity had scooped up a meagre clump of woodland and planted it in the cave floor below the earth. Clarence inhaled, then released an orgasmic groan. I feel it in the air, don't you? Layla nodded enthusiastically. I felt it too, smelt it, tasted it. The air was fresh, fresher than any air I'd inhaled since childhood, or ever. Clarence took a few steps onto the grassy mound. Then the man announced, "You didn't drink from the fountain?" "No," Layla replied. "How did you know that?" "You have the stench of pure, natural youth," Clarence called loudly as he knelt in the centre of the forest, looking at something concealed behind shrubbery. Layla and I were too far away from him to see it clearly. The woman laughed uncomfortably. "Thank you?" Clarence whispered. "No, thank you. Jeremy, why are you still down there? Come." I strolled up the mound, past the several trees forming that tiny impossible woodland, then came to a stop, a foot or so behind the old man kneeling in the mud. And when I saw it, I almost threw up in fear. In the grass, twitching near motionlessly, there lay not a fountain, but a woman. A nude woman. Though it took a few moments for me to process that. Took a few moments to process that she was even human. For the crippled lady was, without a doubt, the oldest living person I had ever seen. However, to use that word, living, feels disingenuous. Even the oldest humans I've seen in photographs had the appearance of youthful babes in comparison to this formless clump of flesh and bone. The writhing woman seemed to be wrestling with the very grass beneath her bare back, seemed to be stuck there, though I saw no visible restraints. And I was restrained by a terror like no other. I didn't speak, didn't move. I simply stared at this impossibility below me. The woman's complexion was green and infested with some unnatural substance from within the heart of that faux natural place. Another thing I felt in the air itself. Near entirely decomposed rags of blue, seemingly from some ancient sundress, lay beside the woman's restless body. Those clothes no longer covered her. Even her saggy strips of off-colour skin barely offered her skeletal form a modicum of modesty. I knew what she was supposed to be. The fountain itself. But she was not some embodiment of youth. That fleshy fount was a cursed thing. I eventually managed to unbind my lips and choked out the words. We have to help her. Clarence laughed and shook his head. Oh, Jeremy, there is no helping this woman. She exists to help us. And she is, as I am sure you see, almost at the end of the road. She would not survive without the forest. It is a kindness for us to let her continue. It is a kindness for her to serve us. Without warning, the old man suddenly lunged forwards like a stray hound, eyeing its first meal in many moons. And I watched something that would be burnt into my retinas for the rest of my life. I watched the director sink his teeth into the woman's teat. She opened her mouth to scream, but had no energy to do so, no breath left in her lungs. I did the screaming for her. I watched helplessly as Clarence suckled, lapping up the fountain of youth's essence. Whatever essence this near corpse of a woman had left to give. Her torso undulated, pumping up and down in rapid motions, and her skin clung ever tighter to her skeleton. Then, after as little as 10 seconds, though it felt like an eternal nightmare to me, Clarence stopped. He came up for air with a splutter, as if reacting to something he shouldn't have ingested. And I became aware of something horrid. The woman was no longer twitching, no longer breathing. Yes, as I suspected, she has reached the end of the road, Clarence explained to me again, before delicately closing the woman's eyelids. You have blessed me this past century, Florence. I gasped when my director turned towards me, when I finally saw his face. The man's skin was smoother, and the whites of his hair had turned more of a dull grey. He looked closer to my age. I cried. What have you done? What have you done? Not nearly enough, the man answered, as he climbed to his feet with a near spring in his step, near youthfulness. The fount demands renewal. Every century or two, its well runs dry, and a new source must be found. Now Florence has passed. Another must take her place. I seized clumps of my hair, eyeballing the drained corpse on the ground. That was a person. You killed her. Clarence smiled. I did nothing of the sort, Jeremy. Florence died in the 19th century, the day she became the fountain. In fact, when I first met her, several years later, she, the fountain, was already old. Well, not old as such, rather spent, physically ruined. So many had used her before me. However, they said that she was once the most beautiful woman on the East Coast. What is wrong with you? I whispered, backing down the grass mound towards Layla, the woman who was standing silently, as if lost in a trance. I wasn't sure she had even processed anything that had just happened. What would you have me do, Jeremy? Asked Clarence with a cutting snarl. As I explained, I wouldn't have been able to free Florence. She was already dead. Do not look at me as if I were the culprit. I didn't bind her to this place. I was simply one of many who travelled far to see her. She had already flitted from cavern to cavern across the Bahamas. When I first found her, she resided beneath the island of South Bimini, as I recall. Something horrified me about the way in which Clarence spoke of Florence, as if he were a university professor, recounting historical events in a nonchalant manner. Worse than that, he spoke of her not as a person, but as an object, to be milked. A poor soul doomed to over a century in that underground dungeon, whilst dozens or perhaps hundreds of folk drained her beauty and left only dregs behind. I do admit that I often wish I'd been able to guzzle some of her splendour in the early years, Clarence confessed. When I first met Florence, she was still a fair sight, of sorts, but the girl's well had already dried up quite significantly. I hacked again, finding that I either had no contents in my stomach or no strength to expel them. Take a look at me, won't you? Clarence begged, throwing his arms wide to flaunt his newly youthful physique. Jeremy, I've shaved off 20 years or so, and if Florence hadn't been quite so depleted, I would have filed away even more of the wrinkles. Why, I'd be younger than you by now. But fear not, it is time. Time, as I said, for the fount to have its renewal. The old man lifted a hand upwards, and then Layla seemed to obey some unspoken command, much as she had done on Malik's ferry. I wearily eyed the mindless girl as she took strides forwards, traipsing across the green mound with a hollow look in her eyes. Once she was standing before us, Clarence pointed his finger downwards, pointed at the bag of bones and crumpled skin that had once been Florence. What followed pushed any remaining vomit up to the top of my throat. Layla knelt against the grass, swiveled her body to the side, then lay atop Florence's corpse. The hypnotised girl squirmed around, crunching and flattening the bones beneath her back, so as to nestle. Then she whispered a word. Theo. Layla's body immediately and rigidly fixed to the ground, in much the same way as Florence before her. It was as if the new woman had signed a contract, but I knew the truth was far more diabolical than that. Layla didn't agree to any of it. The tear trickling down her cheek said as much. It betrayed the smile on her face, the rapidly diminishing smile. Clarence had done something to Layla before I even climbed into that taxi cab. We will start gently, promised the director as he took the woman's wrist. Acting without hesitation once again, Clarence thrust his face into Layla. Yet upon meeting her flesh, the man sank his teeth slowly into his victim. As if savouring a ripe piece of fruit. The 20-something-year-old woman's soft, velvety complexion started to crease, gaining a few lines around the eyes. And her hair turned white from the roots to the split tips. At first, Layla screamed for help, and I found that I could do nothing. Something was fixing me in place, much in the same way as her. Supernaturalism or fear, one of the two. But awfully, the woman's screams started to quieten as her raging vocal cords deteriorated. There was something utterly terrifying about witnessing the very theft of a person's youth. Most terrifyingly of all, it was being stolen in such an unjustly fast amount of time. I realised that Layla would never get to enjoy decades of life as I had. I realised that I had been a fool. A short-sighted fool. Age was no curse. The moving fountain was a curse. After 30 seconds spent paralysed, I finally managed to unfix my feet from the ground, breaking free from the hypnotic spell of either that underworld or Clarence. Perhaps both. With terror and fury intermingled in my heart, I dashed forwards and swung my steel-toed boot into the suckling man's face. A man who had acquired the appearance of a gentleman in his 30s. He was flung from Layla's form and sent tumbling down the grassy mound as an unconscious rag doll. Then I fell to my knees at the foot of that new fountain, with tears filling my eyes, and I attempted to lift her up, but she wouldn't budge. The woman looked so frail, yet her body wrestled so powerfully against me. She was one with the forest, immovable. Layla whimpered, "There is no undoing it. Only death will." Her bloodshot eyes bulged and met mine. The grey-haired woman started to nod feverishly, and I, having caught her drift, shook my own head. I didn't want to do it. Didn't want to do what she was silently asking me to do. "Please," she begged. I don't want to suffer." Layla gingerly scooped a pocket knife out of her jacket, and I took it from her gnarled, emaciated fingers. I needed a moment to think, but there came the rustle of grass from the other side of the mound, reminding me that there was no time to think. Layla's pleading face told the same story. Besides, the longer I hesitated, the sicker I felt. So I acted. With a cry of revulsion, I plunged the knife into the fountain's temple. Layla's life flitted away not like that of a person, but a wilting flower. Her skin and skeleton both shriveled, accompanying the remnants of Florence. Then both corpses began to slip between blades of grass, taking the journey into the soil, together. An animalistic roar of disapproval sounded moments later, and it was followed by the sensation of a heavy force thumping into my body. "No!" I tumbled to the ground and felt bumps in the grass below. Felt the freshly buried bones of Layla and Florence beneath me. Before my senses had clocked what was happening, I'd been pinned to the grass by Clarence. Even if I'd seen him coming, however, I doubt I would have had the upper hand. As a man who had become younger than me, the director possessed far greater bodily fortitude. "You imbecile," he growled. "Why would you take her from me? From us? I think you've had your fill of youth, old man," I wheezed, as Clarence pressed his elbow against my jugular. "There's such a thing as living too long. For animals, not gods," whispered Clarence deliriously, pressing harder against my windpipe. "I suppose I shall have to take the last drop of youth from you instead." "No, I won't say the word," I promised, choking against his elbow. The man laughed. "That word is merely a binding ritual. It fixes a fount to the earth below. It extends a fount's life. But I do not need you to say it. You are already lying against the forest's beating heart, my boy. Don't you feel it against your back? I know you do. We both feel it, hear it, smell it. The forest will bleed through you and expel your youth into me." I did feel it. Felt not only the bony remains beneath me, but that other thing, warm and sickly, from far below. Something not at all as beautiful as I had initially thought. Something parasitic. And as I broadened my eyes, petrified of the fate that awaited me, the old man opened his jaws again. "This will hurt for 100 years, he promised in a cold whisper. Clarence did not sink his teeth into my wrist, as he had done with Layla. He tore into my neck. I caterwauled throughout the process, a process quicker than earthly words can describe, for it was accelerated far beyond earthly laws. I aged at a rate no mortal thing should ever endure. I could feel the very hairs in my head dying, could feel the joints in my body becoming brittle and frail, could feel my organs hurrying more quickly towards that bright light at the end of the tunnel. Throughout the ordeal, all I thought was that I needed more time. More time with my family. And that was when I focused on my fingers, which were still wrapped around something against the forest floor. Layla's pocket knife. I was clutching it tightly above the handle, and the blade had cut into my palm, draining my blood into the grass. With my last ounce of energy, I yelled and flung my flimsy arm upwards, before sticking the knife into Clarence's upper thigh. The man lurched backwards, falling from his position atop me with a loud wail of pain. I relished in the feeling of those horrible fangs releasing from my neck, and the immediate return of my natural aging process. Only, I had gained, as far as I could tell, several years, perhaps a whole decade. Meaning there was no time to dawdle. I was even older and weaker than before. I took the opportunity to remove the knife from Clarence's leg. Then I began to stick it repeatedly into the young man's side, who screamed primarily as he collapsed to the grass in agony. Clarence blared out of a dozen little puncture marks, running up from his thigh to his upper torso, and I saw in his eyes that I'd levelled the playing field. He was weak enough for me to pin him to the ground. So I held the knife to the man's throat. "Say the word," I whispered, pressing the blade until it drew blood. The young man's weak eyes wandered as he continued to bleed profusely. "No." "Say it and become the fountain," I ordered. "Or become nothing at all." No, please," he hoarsely begged, limp hands clamping ineffectively against his blood-stained abdomen. "Why are you begging, sir? I'm offering you a chance to survive," I snarled, fury driven by thoughts of Layla and Florence. "You claimed that life should be measured in quantity, not quality. So, say the word, and you will become the fountain. You will live much longer." Any sane person would have chosen the knife, would have chosen to die naturally. Clarence, however, was barely a person. He had warped his mind and soul after 100 years of clinging to life, clinging to youth. The subhuman monster wasn't ready to let it all end. "Theo," he murmured. Clarence's body immediately jolted downwards and glued to the grass. He was bound to the forest, and his eyes shot wide open, as if that unnatural place had imbued him with life. Of course it came at a price. His freedom. I considered, for a moment, lifting the man's wrist and taking my youth back, reclaiming the decade or so that he'd stolen from me. But as I hungrily eyed the flesh, I felt that force below the soil, calling to me yet again. And I knew that I would end up like Clarence if I were to taste even a droplet of water from the fountain of youth. I didn't want to risk it, so I clambered to my feet. "What are you doing?" the faux young man queried, thrashing against the invisible restraints that bound him to the grass. "Drink from me. Do it." "No," I said. "I wouldn't want to steal your youth, Clarence. Not when you've worked so hard for it. I'll let you be. It's the kinder way." No, wait," whispered Clarence meekly, as his fate clearly dawned on him. I backed down the grassy mound, but kept my eyes on the forest ahead, even after the man slipped out of view behind the shrubbery. I was still terrified that the monster would find some way to unbind himself, rush towards me, and steal the last of my life. I only turned on my heel and ran, once I had reached the tunnel's entrance. When I made it back to the surface, I dashed through North Bimini's dense woodland and beelined towards the island shore. I was greeted by a puzzled Captain Mike, who asked about the others whilst hoisting me onto the boat. I invited the man to go and look for them down in the cave, but I told him that we would both be better leaving that place and never returning. Malik was, I am absolutely certain, on the verge of questioning me, until he noted the purple finger marks on my neck, noted the greyer number of white hairs on my head, and brown wrinkles on my face. I had aged impossibly. There was no other way of explaining it. And the man understood as much. His silent look of fear said that he understood. Malik had heard Clarence's claims. I have no doubt that he pieced together enough of the story to realise it had all been real. The captain nodded his head, hurriedly untied the ropes, and swiftly set sail back to the east coast. I still hear Clarence's screams. They carried down that underground tunnel like a ghostly wind and followed me back to the surface. Followed me across the sea. I think I will hear his undead moans forever. After all, he is still down there. He moves from place to place, of course, but he is still very much alive. That moving fountain of flesh and bone.